Welcome, everyone. We're about to get started. I'm just going to take us through a few housekeeping items before we officially kick off. Welcome. I'm Charlotte from South North, part of the Voices for Just Climate Action program. So just to help us know who's in the room, please make sure that your Zoom tag has your name and preferably your organization. Please make sure you're on mute. We'll be quite a large group today, so if you could mute yourself during the presentations, that would be great. And we will have a Q&A box, so please do post in the Q&A box during our session questions for our speakers. You're welcome to post those questions in your own language. We do have interpretation today in French, Spanish, Brazilian, Portuguese, Bahasa, and English. And you can post comments in the chat box, or if there's during the Q&A discussion, if you have something you'd like to add, you're welcome to raise your hand. Right, so we have interpretation in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Bahasa. So please feel free that when you are speaking to speak in any of those languages, just make sure that you have joined an interpretation channel. Even if you might be able to hear me fine now if you're listening to English, but please make sure you are in the English channel, as you won't be able to hear interpretation for all of our speakers. If you have any technical challenges, you can email us below at info@vca@southnorth.org. Great, and I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Paula Elenga, who is the Director of Climate Action at Fundación Avina, to welcome us and kick off our event today. Paula, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Good morning to everyone. It's a sincere pleasure and privilege to be in this session today. We are already 55 people from all over the world. I know there were more than 200 people registered from different sectors and countries. So it's a real privilege to be here today. I want to thank you all for being and welcome to this session. This webinar builds on similar webinars and workshops that we did in previous years, but with less people, where we were exchanging some practical information about participating at COPs. And we found that was very relevant and very valued by participants. And now this time we come together in this workshop with the alliances of VCA, Voices for Just Climate Action, Impulsouth and Resilience Hub. And I want a special thanks to the three alliances and to all the team that has been behind organizing the session today. I want also give as for a special thank you for South North for the translation, and to the funders, the IDRC, International Development Research Center, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and the Global Resilience Partnership for supporting this initiative. This webinar will tackle some of the challenges and opportunities to participate and engage effectively at COPs. COPs and other climate governance spaces are often exclusive and exclusionary. And what we understand is that if we don't have the spaces for representation of different voices to engage in narrative building and decision-making at global level, that's also a barrier to climate justice. So we hope that with this webinar, we can make a contribution, a small contribution, to some of the challenges that often limit the participation at global level. These barriers are related to the right to engage in some spaces, understanding which are the spaces where different participants can speak, but also technical and also language. Sometimes there's not the language understanding or the technical understanding to engage with COPs. And I'm sure that with the excellent speakers that we have here today, Andres Mogo and Salim Hook and Charlotte, you're going to have a great insight and hopefully be able to support your participations at COP. And hope to meet you all in the venue in December. Thank you. And over to you, Charlotte.
Great. Thank you so much, Paula, for opening our event today. I think that really sets the scene very well for what we hope to achieve with our speakers today. So first, I'm going to hand over to Andres Mojo, who is the Regional Manager of Resilience and Climate Transition Program at Fundación Avina. Andres has been participating in the climate negotiations for the last 10 years. He's also recently been the author of a guidebook on climate negotiations, which we will hopefully also link to in the chat. But Andres, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And thank you everyone for the invitation to participate in this workshop. I am going to take advantage of the fact that we have translation in many languages and speak in Spanish during my presentation so that our colleagues following from Latin America can get a clear sense of some of the challenges to participating at the COP. But I want to begin by acknowledging the same thing that Paula just mentioned now. Probably one of the biggest challenges to participating in a COP, at least from a Global South perspective, is related to language, because all of these processes take place in English and it is not easy to engage in a second language coming from the Global South. So with that, I'll switch to Spanish now.
Thank you very much for having us at this workshop. I'll be delivering a presentation on how to be a part of COP28. Let's focus on the two roles we have here. On the one hand, we have negotiations. Informally, we talk about it as the blue zone. And I will also be focusing on the green agenda. This is what we call the green zone. Physically speaking, we usually see a split into a blue zone and a green zone at the COP. For example, here you can see the map for COP26 and for COP27. We had separate spaces for the blue zone and the green zone. And in COP27, they also had a blue zone and a green zone. Now, let me tell you what it means to be in these different spaces. Each one of these spaces has a different focus. The blue zone is way more focused on negotiations. So if an attendee is more focused on negotiations, on official outcomes, on resolutions, and on decisions, it is very likely that these attendees will spend more time in the blue zone. This blue zone will also be led by governmental representatives from negotiators, delegations, co-presidencies, etc., etc. At the end of the COP, it is very likely that we'll see results coming from here. And these could be criticized or praised, but results are probably coming from here. Now, the green zone has a parallel agenda. On the one hand, we have pavilions and businesses. We have activism. We have side events. And we have relevant networking opportunities. Let's look at the map for COP26. As the years went by, the green zone became bigger and bigger. We now know that in COP28, the green zone will be 3 times as big as in COP27, and it was already very big in COP27. So everything that is related to events, side events, pavilions, business, and networking will be much bigger. So there's a lot more potential now. This is available to everyone who wants to be a part of the COP. Now let's go back to the blue zone. We can think about the context of these negotiations, what they're negotiating, and why it's so hard to enter into these negotiations. So let me quickly talk about the negotiation of the UN Convention on Climate Change, the framework. This is where we get the commitments that we have been negotiating upon. We need to think about our biggest objectives. Our biggest objectives is to reach the stabilization of greenhouse gases concentration at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame that is sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. We have a few keywords here. We're talking about a level that is enough to prevent dangerous interference within a time frame. And I'm mentioning this because oftentimes when it comes to the climate, we see descriptions that are not clear and that end up becoming ambiguous. This framework has very clear objectives, but they've never determined what the level is, what dangerous means, and what the time frame is. So these negotiations in the past ended up being very open to interpretation. The Paris Agreement also talked about principles that are very important for these negotiations. We have the CBDR principle, for example. According to this principle, we see that the countries that are involved in this process need to lead in combating climate change and its adverse effects. We also see specific needs and circumstances of developing countries, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to climate changes. It's also important to acknowledge that we've never created a list of vulnerable countries. Of course, if a country is an island, or if they are least developed countries, meaning they are not as developed, obviously they are more vulnerable to climate change. But beyond that, we don't have a specific list. This framework also talks about a number of commitments. These commitments will vary depending on the country. We may see the Ministry of the Environment, or we may see environmental agencies who will be responsible for GHG inventories, mitigation programs, technology transfer, strengthening carbon programs, adaptation programs, scientific research, information exchange, education and awareness raising, and national communications. So these are reports where countries report on everything they are doing for climate change to the UN. Now, there's a big difference between the commitments in 4.1 and the commitments in 4.3, 4.5, and 4.7. Because these commitments in 4.1 are for every country, both developing and developed countries. However, these other commitments are for developed countries. These ones shall provide new and additional financial resources so that developing countries can meet all the commitments listed in 4.1. This means that the convention establishes that the activities that developing countries are going to carry out should be funded by new and additional financial resources coming from developed countries. Number 4.7 talks a bit more about that. They say the extent to which developing countries will effectively implement their commitments under the convention will depend on the effective implementation by developed countries of their commitments related to financial resources. So we see very clear conditions in the convention regarding who is going to implement these commitments and what it entails. Now, let me talk about what is negotiated here.
There's an international agreement that is binding and universal about climate change. Needs to have 3 points. Ambition, it needs to be enforceable, and it needs to have universal participation, of course. During climate debates, unfortunately, we didn't reach those 3 points in our agreement. We had, for instance, in the case of the convention, the first agreement that we reached, we had ambition and participation. However, during the negotiations, we tried getting to this legal binding aspect, but we did not reach it, despite the fact that it is clear who is going to finance it and how the points will be implemented. We've negotiated several points that did not reach an agreement. After the UNFCCC in 94, we had the Kyoto Protocol in 97, but that only became officially implemented in 2005. The protocol had ambition because it had top-down commitments in order to reduce the emissions in 5%, and it also included a list of 5 countries that were committed to reducing those emissions. In fact, it also had the legal binding aspect, but it did not have universal participation because the protocol had as a goal to include the countries that were in the top emission list. And the US only came in 2012. Australia left the protocol, Russia, Canada as well, Japan. And this led the protocol to a status in which only the European Union was participating, and they did not have the pressure in terms of international trade to keep reducing their emissions. We now have the Paris Agreement that came to occupy this empty space. We do have universal participation in the Paris Agreement and enforceability, but what's lacking in this case is ambition. Why is that so? Because the agreement establishes that the countries approach their NDCs, but each country has to establish their own commitments in terms of numbers. So the figures are dependent on the level of ambition of each one of the members. In the Kyoto Protocol, the participation was what's lacking, and the Paris Agreement, what's lacking is the ambition, as I just said. So in general terms, all of the negotiations you will see during COP will have to do with those 3 different aspects that are very crucial. What's happening now? Then when it has to do with this international scheme of negotiations, the Paris Agreement established that 9 to 12 months in advance before 2020, each country had to present their NDC, and they had to start implementing the NDC between 2020 and 25. Meanwhile, they had to monitor the NDC and build a new one. They needed to present biannual transparency reports every 2 years, of course, starting in 2024. We also went through a process of global assessment that was concluded in this first cycle, but every 5 years, this cycle begins again with a couple of adjustments until we reach a situation in which we are in compliance with the points stated in each agreement, the Paris Agreement currently. Now, I would like to touch on a different point, the different interests and positions of all of the countries involved, the developed ones and the developing ones. In the case of the developed countries, the mitigation of greenhouse gases is at the center of climate change goals and in their international policies, of course. And this will be concentrated in the top emission countries and the ones that will be the top emission countries in the future. This needs to be a joint effort, and we recognize that the sources of public finances won't have the enough resources for this climate action to be effective. For the developing countries in the global south, adaptation is a priority because in the global south, populations are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and the impacts that we feel are not impacts that the developed countries caused, because they know that mitigation is enabled by finance, of course. And the provision of finance is a binding commitment for the public sectors of developed countries. The funding is not enough, but the developed countries have this responsibility. It is the public sector that needs to be monitored, that needs to establish goals and needs to be in compliance with the goals set. That does not mean that we do not have goals for the public sector. We do, and they are the most crucial ones. How do the negotiations work? Well, in two ways. We have the larger scheme with the plenaries, and in these plenaries, we usually have these massive meeting rooms with seats for all of the observers of the country representatives, but the plenary only take place in the beginning and at the closure session of the negotiations. And during those negotiations, we usually have roundtables in which you have contact groups or informal meetings. In the contact groups, you see roundtables, such as the one you see in the picture, or in auditorium rooms. Those negotiations are usually led by the following stakeholders: government representatives or party delegates. But we also have the fundamental participations of NGOs, environmental NGOs, indigenous peoples, observers, and media representatives. And the main groups that participate are usually characterized by developing or developed countries. We have 45 developed ones and 145 countries that are still in developing status, and 70% participation of Global South and 30% by the Global North. In the context of negotiations, the number of participants is usually the opposite. So 70% of the Global North and 30% participation by the Global South. It is important to mention it because the Global South participation is usually limited. Why is that? Because of technical constraints and financial ones as well. The main groups from the developed countries category are the umbrella group: US, Australia, Japan, Russia, and Canada. The group called Environmental Integrity, EIG, Switzerland, Mexico, Liechtenstein, South Korea, and Monaco. And the European Union also. And the largest group from the developing countries is G77 plus China, with subgroups of negotiations, which is complex because it is very difficult to reach a common agreement. But I am not going to go into details about that now. I would like to close now with this last slide, talking about the green zone of the COP. So I will leave the space of the negotiations and talk about the parallel agenda. It is important to say that for climate change, COP is the largest UN meeting with between 40 to 80,000 participants during those 2 weeks, which means that most of the participants will go there because other participants will be there occupying the same space. It is a very important space for networking. So you meet people who live in Indonesia, South America, North America, Africa. Everyone will be there at the same place, and it is a unique opportunity for establishing connections. It is very crucial to identify the valuable opportunities beforehand. What can be those opportunities then? How can you make the most out of this opportunity of being at COP? Well, you can ask yourself 4 questions. Do we want to make contacts during the COP event? If the answer is yes, it is really important that you prepare yourself and prepare your contact info. Be sure you have a website ready or presentation cards. And also maybe printed information where to use to talk about your work. You can also contact in advance, reach out to those people, to those players and actors you want to maybe meet with, identify, send emails, or arrange meetings. See who are the observers, who are the contact points, so you can talk to them before the event takes place. If the goal is to make contacts, ask yourself if you can actually invest on those contacts. Maybe you can organize a cocktail meeting or invite them to dinner. Those spaces and occasions are important. The second question is, do we want to show what we do? Do we want to evidence what we do? Well, then you can maybe consider the possibility of organizing a UN side event, which are usually organized in advance. Applications are closed in June. You can also participate in the pavilion events in order to identify your allies that can generate good opportunities for you. You can also think of the possibility of having your own space, which includes contacting organizers, organizing your budget, logistics, your material, and finding the right venue. You can also organize a press conference, a media office, or a press conference request, which can take place within the COP program. The third question, I apologize, would be, do we want to influence global agenda? In order to do so, it is crucial to join coalitions like Youngos or CAN International, maybe indigenous groups or NGOs. And in order to participate in those, you need to be very well informed about their agenda and the status of negotiations. You need to observe very closely and take action. Public demonstrations, events, you will see newsletters, and you need to find the decision makers. What are the spaces that those decision makers are occupying? Question number 4 would be, do we want to join a partnership or any initiative? You need to ask yourself, who would be your allies? You can talk to Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, Resistance Hub. But please do remember to consult with the headquarters before you join any alliance. And I would like to close now by saying the following sentence: raise your voice. It is important to use COP as an opportunity to be heard. I leave you here my contact. We are always open in case you need to talk to me about COP28 and give you more advice. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Andres.
Thank you very much, Andres.
A very informative presentation. I think it really gives us a great introduction to UNFCCC and COP as a space itself. If you have questions for Andres, please put them in the Q&A box. We will have chance to do some Q&A, but first I'm going to go to our next speaker. And we are very pleased to have with us Professor Salim Al-Haq, who is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICCAD. ICCAD is also, along with Fundación Avina, SSN, and a few other partners, is one of the managing partners of the Resilience Hub, who have a pavilion in the Blue Zone. And so we'd love to invite Professor Salim Al-Haq to discuss with us some of the opportunities for civil society participation at COP and influencing. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And thank you, Andres, for that excellent presentation and explanation. Apologies for my sore throat. So let me start by my primary qualification to be speaking to you, which is that I'm one of the few people who's been to every single COP, all 27 of them. But I hasten to add that I don't go as a negotiator. I'm not part of the government. I go as an observer. I go with a yellow badge as a academic or a researcher. But I do have a role in the negotiations. I advise one of the groups that Andreas showed you of the G77 in China, which is the group of least developed countries. There's 46 of them, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, but a few in Asia, including my country, Bangladesh. Unfortunately, none of them are in Latin America. There's only Haiti in Latin America. But this group is very active. It's currently chaired by Senegal. And I've been advising the group initially on adaptation and now on loss and damage. So I play a role as an advisor to the negotiators, but I'm not a negotiator myself. And one of the things that I will share with you is how I see the COP and how it has evolved over time, over the last 30 years. The first thing to mention is that the Conference of Parties is primarily a meeting of parties to the convention, which is governments who have signed and ratified the UN Framework Convention, which is all countries, 195. So the governments come together at the Conference of Parties every year to review progress. So the primary participants and negotiators are representatives of governments, of parties, and they are the ones who get to enter the main negotiations. As Andreas said, when the plenary is over and they go into the negotiating rooms, then observers like us are often not allowed to go into those rooms. And so the negotiators number between 5,000 or 10,000 representatives. As Andres said, the number from the global north of people outnumber 2 times or more the number from the global south in the negotiation, but they are the actual negotiators. So they have been negotiating the Framework Convention and its implementation. Initially, we had the Kyoto Protocol, but in 2015, in Paris at the 21st Conference of Parties, we actually made a very big breakthrough in agreeing the Paris Agreement, which, as Andreas has already mentioned, we have agreed to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees developed countries have agreed to provide $100 billion a year to the developing countries starting from 2020. We are not on track for either of them, but we have agreements. So we've made agreements, but we are not implementing those agreements. And we are going to review and take stock take in COP28 in a few months' time in Dubai. But a very important thing happened with the Paris Agreement, in my view, and that is the Paris Agreement unlocked who needs to be involved in implementing the Paris Agreement. All right. Until the Paris Agreement was achieved, we needed governments and heads of government to agree to things. They had to be involved in order for us to get agreement. We got it. Once they agreed and we have the Paris Agreement, it's actually a pathway to tackle climate change, from mitigation to adaptation to now loss and damage and finance and many other things. And that pathway can be joined by anybody, all of us. We have license now to implement the Paris Agreement. We don't need the permission of our president or our prime minister or our minister of environment. Whoever we are, whatever we want to do, we can actually do it. We are empowered. The Paris Agreement empowers every citizen on the planet to take action to implement the Paris Agreement. We don't need anybody's permission to do that. All right? And so one of the things that has happened after COP21 is that the COP every year, as Andreas said, it gets many tens of thousands of participants. Only 10,000 are negotiators. The other 20, 30,000 are non-negotiators. Why are they going there? What are they doing there? In my view, they are actually the more important participants in the COP. And the COP is actually two COPs now. The first COP is what I call the COP of the talkers, the negotiators. They talk way into the night, sometimes all night. Sometimes they don't finish on time and they take an extra day to keep on talking. And at the end, they come up with something, a decision on paper. But the paper doesn't mean much because they go home and they don't implement it. All right. So the negotiators are the talkers. They are the COP of the talkers. The rest of us are the COP of the doers. And that's what we do in the pavilions, in the blue zone, in the green zone, the networking that Andres talked about. It's meeting up with fellow people who want to do something. You pick a topic, pick forestry, pick indigenous peoples, pick mitigation, pick coal phase out, anything you want. You will find allies and people working on that from all over the world, and you have an opportunity to network with them. And the Resilience Hub that we've been running for several years is one of those places where you can network, bring people together. And in fact, you will see nowadays the COP presidency has a theme for every day of the COP. These themes, there's a theme on mitigation, a theme on coal, a theme on agriculture this year, a theme on health this year. These themes have nothing to do with the negotiations. These are not reflected in the negotiation. They are just themes for people who are doing things on health or agriculture to come together and do something and make announcements. And these announcements of doers, there may be some governments coming together, there may be private sector coming together, NGOs, civil society, academics, many different stakeholders and many different groups from all over the world coming together to declare and share what they're doing in terms of action to tackle climate change. So I distinguish between acting to tackle climate change and talking about it. The talkers are the negotiators, the actors are the rest of us. Before I close, let me just say, if you want to influence the negotiations, the negotiators, then my advice would be to talk to your own country negotiators. Before you go to the COP, talk to them before you go, tell them what you would like to see. Talk to them during the COP when you are there, give your advice to them, because they are the ones who are inside the negotiations. You are not, you and I are not. We can only pass on messages through negotiators whom we know. And the ones that we all know are our own country negotiators. So we should meet with them, and as Andreas said, invite them for dinner or a coffee, have a chat with them, ask them about what's happening, what they are doing, and then tell them what you would like them to do, because they are your representatives. Sometimes you may get a chance to actually become part of the delegation. Nowadays, a lot of governments take in NGOs and young youth as members of their delegation. You get a pink badge, which is a government delegate badge, and they allow you to participate in the negotiation. They don't allow you to talk, but they allow you to go into the meetings and listen. That's a valuable experience. If you manage to get that, I would recommend that you do it and you get inside the negotiation. And finally, let me just say that there is a myth that in order to affect the negotiations, you have to physically go to the COP, and everybody wants to go to the COP. Going to the COP is good. It's nice. It's a networking opportunity. But if you really want to follow the COP, you don't have to go to the COP. And in the last 2 years, my center here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, we have been running a short online course. We call it Following the COP Without Going to the COP. And we provide you with, if you want to join, you're most welcome. It's online, but the time zones might be a little bit challenging from the Americas. But nevertheless, it's something that might be of interest to some people. In fact, if you want to join, I'll put the website on the chat, and you can send an email or look at the website. But it basically enables you to follow one aspect, not everything. You cannot follow everything. You have to pick something. So we pick loss and damage. I do loss and damage. My colleague who's a senior negotiator on climate finance, he does finance, and another colleague who's a senior negotiator on adaptation does adaptation. So we do 3 tracks. During the COP, we do regular webinars on progress, what's happening in the COP, and then after the COP is over, we give a report on what happened, and the participants in the course have to choose the topic, follow that topic, and at the end of the course, they have to write a short essay on what happened on that topic, and on the basis of the essay, we then give them a certificate if they pass the test. So again, you can follow the COP without actually going to the COP if you really want to. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Salim. Excuse me. I really liked your characterization of a COP for doers and a COP for talkers. I think that will definitely stick with us as we experience this COP. And I really also appreciate the idea that you don't have to be in the COP to influence it, and that one event also isn't your only opportunity. You can do lots of influencing before the COP takes place. Great. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. We now have some time for questions. And you're welcome to put your question into the Q&A box, or please do feel free to raise your hand. And even if you are speaking in a different language, we have interpretation, so please do go ahead. I think we did have a question earlier from Fatima, who was saying she is in Niger, and their problem that they've been experiencing as civil society is care, especially in the current state of the coup d'etat that they're experiencing, and they're looking for support from members of civil society, specifically for LDCs. I wondered if either of you have any contacts or thoughts on that.
Let me respond to that. I'm not sure if I can give a useful response, but I'll just give a descriptive one. So the least developed countries are, as the name suggests, some of the poorest countries in the world. Not only are they poor, they happen to be located in places that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, they are now actually receiving those impacts as we speak, as we have segued into what I call the era of losses and damages from climate change. And therefore, for these countries to be able to have sufficient knowledge and capacity to negotiate is a very difficult thing. And one of the big problems is particularly for countries where English is not the common international language they learn. They learn French or they learn Spanish or Portuguese instead. And there's a large number of least developed countries who are Francophone countries, including countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, etc. And so for them, it's even more difficult because in the negotiations, there is interpretation at the plenary. But then once you go into the groups, there's no interpretation available. And if you don't understand English, you're just useless. So my advice to all of these least developed country negotiators, I do a lot of training for them. I've been doing that for many years. And my advice to them is, whatever you do, you must send a delegate who understands and speaks English. Even if he doesn't understand climate, they need to understand English. You can then be there to help them. But if they don't understand English, then they will be completely lost and they will not be able to participate effectively in the negotiations. So that's an important point. The other thing is having capacity to understand negotiations, go to the negotiations, follow the negotiations. It's very complicated. It takes a lot of time and effort. It's not easy to understand. It's particularly negotiating can be extremely confusing. And if you're not an expert in language and in sentences, the sentences and language that is presented can be extremely confusing. And so often the poorer countries just lack that expertise and knowledge. And it's unfortunate.
Salim, I think that certainly resonates with some challenges within VC. We also experienced last year, I think, having an interpreter with you also requires an additional badge, additional funds, and all of those are in short supply anyway. Great, I see a few other questions. I think there's one for Andres in the chat from Paz. Could you mention more about the main commitments that countries must fulfill and how civil society can generate pressure to increase ambition?
Thank you very much for that question. So the main commitments are those derived from the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, as I had said in the beginning, only stipulates that countries need to develop, present, implement, and report on their NDCs. So those commitments are in each country's NDCs. You will be able to easily find them if you look in Google for the NDC registry. You can just type NDC registry UNFCCC, and then you will see the list of countries and their individual commitments. The problem with each is not necessarily, and that was my point when I was talking about ambition in the Paris Agreement, the problem is not necessarily that a country will not implement its commitment. I think the problem relates to how appropriate that commitment is with regards to the country's circumstances, the country's emissions, and the level of urgency that climate change requires internationally. And that is one of the conclusions that the global stocktake process will do this year. So while it is important to look at individual party commitments, it's also important to look at their context and the level of responsibility, both current and historical responsibility that countries have with respect to those commitments. Aside from NDCs, and I do want to make another point because NDCs are mainly focused on mitigation. Countries are supposed to implement additional actions other than just mitigation. If you look at Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which stipulates the objectives of the agreement, you have a global goal on adaptation, global goal on mitigation, and a one on finance. So it's important that those three be implemented equally. And Article 3 of the Paris Agreement says that NDCs should cover mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building. But sadly, most NDCs, particularly from developed countries, are only making reference to mitigation. So there's a big gap there with regards to how we fulfill commitments related to finance, technology, and capacity building. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. There's also another question from Paz, which I think could go to both of you, but Salim, maybe to touch on your thoughts first about what do you think the most relevant topics are or issues, I'm assuming in the negotiations that are foreseen for COP28 in your perspective?
I mentioned earlier, focus almost entirely on the issue of loss and damage from climate change. The reason I do that is because, unfortunately, it is now happening. Climate change is not something that's going to happen that we want to prevent or we want to be ready for. It's happening and we're not ready for it. And so to me, the number one priority now has to be helping the victims who are suffering the impacts of climate change right now. Just a few days ago in Libya, over 10,000 people lost their lives from a flash flood. And the scientists who studied this attribution have said it was 50 times more likely because of climate change. Okay? So climate change is now attributable to any hydrometeorological event around the world that's taking place. And we can attribute these impacts are because we have raised global temperature above 1.1 degree. We failed to prevent it, and we are continuing to fail. So in the negotiations, this issue has for a very long time been highly politically sensitive, because we, the vulnerable developing countries, raise it every year, but the developed countries don't want to talk about it, and decisions can only be made by consensus. If the polluters do not want to talk about loss and damage, we cannot force them to talk about it. And they have refused to talk about it for many, many years, until last year. So last year at COP27, we managed, I won't go into the details, but we managed to out-diplomat the developed countries and make them agree to something they did not want to agree to. Okay? And that is the decision in COP27 to set up a loss and damage fund. They were not going to do that. We made them do that. I won't go into the details of how we did it, but that was a great achievement from our side. Now, we need to make that functional. So the process for doing that is they've set up a transitional committee with 24 members. The transitional committee has been meeting several times. They have one more meeting to go before COP. They will come to the COP with their recommendations, and COP28 will have to decide on what to do next. Now, as I said, I've been watching the COP process for a long time, and I know how it works. And it works very, very slowly. This committee will not finish the job. They are going to come to COP28 and say, well, we've done some things, but we need a lot more time to do something else. And then they're going to ask for more time. And time is not what we have. We have no time. And so the COP28 presidency, and as it happens, the COP28 incoming president, Dr. Al-Jabbar, has an advisory group of which he has invited me to be a member, and I've agreed. And when I agreed to be his COP presidency advisor, I said, I'm a one agenda advisor. My one agenda is you must create the loss and damage fund in COP28 in Dubai. You cannot send it to COP29. You cannot say we made progress, but we didn't manage to finish. We are going to send it to COP29. That's your responsibility. The transitional committee is not going to help you. You, as the COP president, must declare now that you are going to set up the fund. And then you get the politicians from other countries around to make it happen and make the loss and damage fund functional in COP28. And that is a speed that UNFCCC has never done before. When they set up the Green Climate Fund many years ago, the decision to set up the Green Climate Fund was made in one COP, and it took them 5 years to set up the fund. 5 years before the fund was set up. And if you leave them to work at that pace, they will take another 5 years for the loss and damage fund. We don't have that time. So, as I said, I'm a one agenda person. I don't care what happens on the other agenda items. I care about the loss and damage one because people are dying right now and they need our help, and we're not providing any help. And if anybody is interested in following it, as I said, do sign up to our course, and I'll be taking participants through how to follow the loss and damage negotiations and what's happening there.
Thanks very much, Salim. I think many of us would be very interested in following that course after following up after our webinar. Andres, maybe the same question to you. What do you think will be, from your perspective, some of the priority topics?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. I 100% agree with Salim on the loss and damage fund. I was also part of the GCF when it was beginning, and I agree that it took way too long for it to become operational. And as it has become operational, it has also in the last few years been becoming more difficult every year. So it was easier to access the GCF in 2015 than it is now. I agree that the same thing should not happen to the loss and damage fund. So I will not go over that point any longer. I'll just add 2 additional points to the outcomes of COP28. So the first is that this is the first COP to finalize a global stocktake process. I was making reference to the global stocktake process in my presentation. The GST is a process that was envisaged under Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, and we began the GST process a couple of years ago. It is the only process, I would say, within the Paris Agreement that allows for full participation of non-governmental stakeholders and civil society stakeholders. The GST has had many expert dialogues and technical dialogues throughout, and it has provided spaces for non-governmental stakeholders to submit information related to the stocktake process that it has to do. And we know from even now that the results of the global stocktake process will not suggest that we are in line with what science tells us we need to do. So it's important that we take that as strongly as we have to, and that the results of the GST be politically urgent and push parties in the new round of NDCs that most will prepare next year to take the results of the GST into consideration. So it's important to follow that and make sure that the results are as strong as they have to be. And a second issue within the negotiating agenda that I would add is the process of the establishment of a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. This is a process that, again, was decided at Paris that it should be finalized at the end of 2024, so it will not conclude this year, but this is the last chance that we have to guide that process towards an outcome that is not solely political. The current goal on climate finance, many of you may have heard, the 100 billion a year goal was the result of a political process only. So it does not take into consideration the needs and priorities of developing countries. And it's important that the new collective goal that will be set up next year does do that. And we have so far had, and by the COP, we will have had 7 technical dialogues on the NCQG, on the new collective goal process. And we need to make sure that the decision that comes out of COP28 already harvests on some of the conclusions that these dialogues are having. This is something that we were not able to do in COP27, but it's important that we do it now, because it will be impossible to come at the end of next year and remember what happened at a technical dialogue 3 years ago, when the intention was for the goal to be the result of a participatory and collaborative process and not just a political process. So that's why I want to highlight the process of the new collective quantified goal as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Andres. And then I see a question from Theo, which I think many of us can relate to is that there are so many events and sessions to attend at COP as a participant. It can be very overwhelming. What do you recommend attendees keep in mind to make the most of their time? And I think maybe we can start with you, Andres, and then to Salim.
Sure. It is true that too many things happen at the same time at the COP. So what I would advise is to either pick one of the work streams and focus on that, and maybe touch base with colleagues that are following other work streams and have them inform you on what's happening in that. So if you are following negotiations, for instance, negotiations tend to organize themselves in work streams. So you can either follow adaptation negotiations, which will include, in this particular COP, for instance, the global goal on adaptation. You can follow mitigation negotiations, which will include in this COP as well the Sharm el-Sheikh mitigation program, or finance negotiations, including the talks around guidance to the GCF, the GEF, the new collective goal, or the long-term finance process. Or you can follow ambition negotiations, or NDCs, or the global stocktake, or the Indigenous Peoples and Communities platform. I would just advise anyone following negotiations to pick one and make sure that you attend all the sessions, because then it will begin to feel like the soap opera that it tends to be. Or if you're not able to do that, maybe if you can step back and participate in civil society meetings that will be doing that, and that will be providing with an update of what's happening in the negotiations. It's also important, as Salim was suggesting, to liaise with the delegation from your country. It's sometimes more difficult to find a space to speak with your delegation or with your government in your country than it is to do it at a COP, because there's a political commitment from the government representatives attending a COP to attend conversations with civil society from their own country that are also at the COP. So it's a good place to find an agenda and speak with them, ask them about their priorities, what they expect for the COP, what they will be pushing, and then ask for another meeting a week after so that you can get a report from them as well. That is also a very good opportunity to take advantage of during a COP.
Great, thanks, Andres. I think we might have actually lost Salim. I think his connection might have dropped. Yes, I feel so. But before we move on, so our next session is going to be a panel discussion, and then we'll have another chance for Q&A after that. But I thought just before we move on, I know that the Resilience Hub does also have an opportunity for people to share stories of resilience. I believe it's in video, and I wondered if I could ask Theo perhaps to take a few minutes just to tell us a bit about that. Theo, if you're around, feel free to unmute.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. My name is Theo Bacharach, and I'm part of the Resilience Hub team, who are putting on the Resilience Hub at COP28. And this is a physical space. So if you are attending COP in person and would like a space to offer to meet people, the Resilience Hub is there for you. In the blue zone, and we have coffee and water and nice seats, I hope. But we're also available online as a platform that anyone can attend. You just have to register once and you can follow along. My request to this audience is the Resilience Hub is really focused on elevating stories and ideas about climate resilience, but bringing those stories and ideas from different regional perspectives. And we have an opportunity before COP28 and at COP28 to spotlight the voices of diversity of people who are taking action on climate resilience, or think we need to be taking greater action and want to explain why. So I would like to say, if you would like to submit a short video, maybe 30 seconds to 1 minute, sharing your thoughts and ideas on climate resilience, that the Resilience Hub can then spotlight and give a platform to, please do be in touch with me and my colleagues who are on this call as well, because we would love to get as many voices as we can, telling attendees at COP why we need to be taking more action on building the resilience of communities to the impacts of climate change that are already here, as Salim mentioned. Thanks, Charlotte. I really appreciate the opportunity to share that request.
Great. Thanks so much, Theo. Thanks. I know I put you on the spot a bit, but that was great. Thank you. Okay, so next up, well, first, thank you so much to Andres and Salim for their presentations. That was brilliant. We really appreciate your insights and time. Next, we have a really exciting panel. Some of the things Andres in particular mentioned is engaging with some of the constituencies and the platforms that are present at COP and engaged throughout the year and also at COP. So we have 3 speakers today who each have different experience of engaging in slightly different platforms to share with us what those platforms are about, how they work, what they're trying to achieve, and how you as an attendee at COP can participate during the event or perhaps at other times throughout the year. So first, I'd like to welcome Carla Maas, who's from the Climate Action Network, which is part of ENGO, the Environmental and Non-Governmental Organizations constituency. That's right, it rolls off the tongue quite a lot. Yeah, we'd like to invite you to share your thoughts on how can the constituency represent groups who are at COP, how does it work, and what are some of the ways that it engages within the UNFCCC space. Then Carla, over to you.
Thank you everyone for the invitation, for the space, and the possibility to share with you my experience and the occasion to explain to you how we have organized ourselves so far. It is important to say that Ken is one of the observers, and the acronym is ENGO, ENGO, so environmental NGOs. We are not the only representative or the only organizations that represent ENGOs in general. We also have the Demand Climate Justice. We are 2 organizations that are the focal points for the larger group. And this is something important for you to understand. Throughout the time, the GC and us have articulated better to have a common vision as an articulation group. This was an internal process for cohesion and organization that had ups and downs throughout the time. I would love to talk to you about the space that I know better and that I am represented here today. And I would like to tell you about our operations. Climate Action Network is the name of the organization. We have this acronym CAN, and we have several organizations that articulate themselves in this structure with a lot of sections. One is an international one, and it is composed by NGOs and national organizations as well. So one has international organizations and the other national organizations. Why do we have these 2 different sides? Because we have different momentum in those 2 different spaces. In the US, for instance, we have CAN, and in Latin America, we also have CAN. This is where I work in Latin America. And those spaces have different activities. All of those organizations form a constellation in different countries with different levels of reach. Some organizations work with Oxfam, with WWF in an international level, and others work more regionally or nationally, even in Latin America, in Africa, and within countries in those regions. And obviously, there is a lot of variety and diversity in those regions. Some organizations carry out work in political incidents and advocacy, or with projects in order to strengthen the resilience of communities and to enhance the ability of adaptation when it comes to impacts of climate change. So it's a whole universe of different organizations, but with an important characteristic. They all represent a bridge. We're always connecting amongst different organizations to understand better this macro political view and how to use it in our favor nationally. So all the different groups can truly have a voice that is heard internationally and nationally as well. I am sorry if I talk too much and too fast. I am going to end my monologue here and just explain to you a couple of different crucial elements. Why is our articulation so important within civil society? As other speakers have already said, the COP event as a process or as a final point is the result of many negotiations that take a whole year. So in order to make progress in different negotiations and have positive results and efficient that can become operational in different countries, this space of decision-making is extremely different for each country alone and for international forums. So how do we get there? We organize ourselves, we submit proposals, and as we've seen 2 weeks ago, if I am not mistaken, there were a couple of actions raising awareness for us to abandon the dependency on fossil fuels. So that's one example. Civil society is always putting pressure into governments to act, to create change. So when citizens demand something, we are playing a very important role as civil society. And then there's something that is more connected to generating proposals more formally. As Andres already mentioned, there are different themes of negotiation, and each one of those large subjects have a stream for negotiations. So civil society can certainly give their input, and CAN is an accredited organization that can participate in those roundtables and bring ideas that are used in the pool of inputs that are taken to the different process of negotiations.
Also, we don't want to stop at a formal official space. We want to work as a network. We want every international center or organization to have a direct connection with local negotiators or the negotiators in the groups where their countries reside. Because it is in these channels, through these connections, that we'll be able to put forth our propositions, make requirements, and give voice to complaints from civil society. This is how negotiators can get to the COP with our input, with the knowledge of what we want as a civil society. So this is an opportunity we must take advantage of before the COP. So every organization who is interested and who wants to be a part of this process needs to occupy this space. This is a space that happens naturally with these negotiators at a smaller scale, and then we can scale it up throughout the process. We need to make these connections stronger, nationally speaking. Otherwise, we don't have as much advocacy and as much impact. Finally, let me approach something that has already been mentioned. We have a connection between the organizations that work locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, and we need to think about the upstream and downstream of information between these organizations. We see organizations that work on a national level, but they implement actions at the international level. And their ideas and propositions come from their groups. We also see the opposite. We see organizations acting internationally, but they want to actually make national advocacy easier. So we have this back and forth. It's really interesting. And this kind of interaction grows stronger, especially when we recognize how important it is to implement work at all of these levels. This is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carla. I think that it resonated a bit as well with Salim's feedback on the importance of national level engagement. And I really liked your comparison of connecting across levels, your advocacy and the flow of information. I wonder, before we move on to the next speaker, and just to let everybody know that we will have a chance for Q&A after all three speakers have spoken. So please keep your questions for any of them and put them in the chat box. But maybe, Carla, just one follow-up question is for new participants who are arriving at COP28. Do you have advice for how they can get in touch with CAN or other spaces that might be useful for newcomers?
Yes, as I was saying, CAN is a network, and we're talking about a network that is woven throughout the year. We also work at different spaces of advocacy. So these spaces are not exclusive to climate change. We work on other international agendas. So we have a constellation of players who have this kind of advocacy and this kind of relevant work. We're talking about disrupting things, transforming things. When it comes to the COP, I think it's easier to think about it when we think about preparation as a process at every level. And it's always easier when we join some kind of center, maybe regional centers, national centers, international centers, because this is how we can have better impact on people who are working on these negotiations. Or maybe this is how we can figure out how things work. Now, should that not be the case, I can give you some tips on how to prepare for the COP. So if you're not a part of the Climate Action Network, here are my suggestions for you. Depending on where you're located, you should get in touch with the center who is a part of the Climate Action Network. For example, the center connected to Climate Action Network in Latin America. This is how you'll figure out how to be a part of this network. For example, you may have a meeting at 3 p.m. on a certain day of the week, and you know that during this meeting, you're going to get macro updates on the negotiation progress and the things that are about to happen. So for this specific meeting, you have a certain agenda. You may have this meeting every day or on a given day of the week. And if you're a part of these meetings, you're going to get to know the people who are involved, and you'll be able to follow up on these topics at a macro level. We also have work groups. These work groups have been working together during the year, and they also get together during COP28 every day to talk about their work agenda, and to plan their actions and interventions. So if you're interested in a given topic regarding the negotiations, reach out to these work groups. Try to be a part of these meetings. This will enable you to understand the negotiations in a better way. You may also feel a need to do better at networking so that you have better, more sustainable work over time. So that's something I'd recommend too. I think these are the most simple and robust ways to connect at the COP28. Of course, you also have the website that is available to you on the internet. You should be able to find the work groups on their website. You can fill out a form to be in touch with the people who are coordinating these work groups. They belong to different organizations and they either chair or co-chair the work groups.
Great, thank you so much, Carla. I think that was really, really useful and practical for anybody attending COP or preparing to attend COP. Thank you so much. And next, I'm going to hand over to our next panelist, which is Ms. Faith Lumania, who is the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead at Akina Mamawa Africa. Faith is going to share with us some reflections on the women and gender constituency and their experience. Faith, over to you.
Thank you. So it's good that I'm speaking right after Carla, because the ways in which the women and gender constituency organizes is quite similar to how CAN and ENGO specifically organizes. I think for me, one of the ways in which I have benefited from CAN is that at the SB 58 this year, the Bonn Climate Conference, I arrived a week late and I was able to get an update by attending the CAN update, one of the CAN update meetings. And I got an update on everything that had been discussed during the first week. So some of these spaces are really quite beneficial. So I'm going to speak to you about the Women and Gender Constituency. The Women and Gender Constituency is one of the 9 stakeholder groups. So there is one on business, one on trade unions, one on environment that Carla just spoke about. There's indigenous people. So there are 9 of them. I may not be able to list all of them, but the Women and Gender Constituency focuses on ensuring that women's voices and rights are embedded in the entire process. It was founded in 2009, and over the years, a number of things have happened through the different involvement. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is the fact that by 2011, there were 32 member organizations of this particular constituency. And as we speak, there's about 47 of them. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is that as part of enhancing the participation of various groups of women, feminists, and gender justice advocates that are working across the globe, the Women and Gender Constituency is going through what we call regionalization process. And in August this year, we launched the Africa Women and Gender Constituency. Our process is ongoing right now to try and support the establishment of the MENA region Women and Gender Constituency. And there's also an ongoing process to also roll out the Latin America Women and Gender Constituency. In terms of objectives, so one of the things that this particular constituency does is ensure that representation of women's voices is strong, but also specifically focuses on ensuring that the experiences and needs and capacities and lived realities of women across the world, but more specifically those within regions that are most affected by the climate crisis, are heard across all UNFCCC processes. The other thing is that it facilitates the harmonization of common positions. So there are a number of times when we are developing different positions on different thematic areas, and different organizations will present different positions on a specific issue, but because these positions have to be presented to the UNFCCC through one space, the Women and Gender Constituency, we come together and try and build a common position that is then submitted to the different spaces. But also one of the things that the constituency does is facilitate and engage daily women and gender what we call a daily women and gender caucus. So during whether it's the subsidiary body meetings that happen in Bonn every June, or it's the COP, there's usually daily caucus meetings that happen to try and update people on the different areas of negotiation, so that everyone, whether you are focusing on climate finance but are interested in knowing what is being discussed within the adaptation or agriculture or mitigation, you're able to get an update on that. And then the other thing, which is also very important and has been quite valuable in advancing our position, has been being able to liaise with other constituencies. Currently, there's been conversations within the transitional committees around the loss and damage fund. And one of the things that has been valuable has been being able to build together a position with other constituencies, particularly Yungo and Engo. And because so many times some of the positions that are being advanced are quite similar. So the constituency is coordinated by what we call a facilitative committee of these amazing women that I have posted, that are right in front of your screen. And each of them represents a different region within the world. And so they are able to facilitate the engagement and participation of different women that are involved in around climate justice advocacy. So I think one of the things that I was requested to highlight is how the Women and Gender Constituency works. And I will try and summarize this. One of the things that is critical, obviously, because the purpose of the constituencies is to facilitate women's meaningful participation within different UNFCCC processes. And so one of the ways in which this particular constituency works is that there are usually calls that will happen with the secretariat to be able to try and inform and influence, for instance, what the agenda should be. There is also coordination in terms of participation of WGC representatives to the different boards and bodies of the UNFCCC. There is usually one-on-one meetings that happen with the chair and also the co-presidency. Last year, as we were getting closer to COP27, one of the things that we did organize, that we did have, was a meeting with the co-presidency from Egypt, where we were able to present particularly the African positions ahead of COP27. The other thing that the WGC does is coordinating with other constituencies, like I already alluded to, but also it serves as a coordinator for coordinating our submission of different interventions. So for instance, every time there's consultations happening on specific thematic issues, the working group comes together. So because there are different working groups within the Women and Gender constituency, they are able to work together to develop a position. It could be on agriculture, it could be on climate finance, or specifically the new collective quantified goal as one of the issues that has been recently discussed a lot, or it could be around loss and damage, and the list can go on with regard to the thematics. There's also usually monthly calls that happen within the WGC itself, but also with the COP presidency. So the WGC monthly meetings that happen are able to inform the engagement that would happen then with the COP presidency. But also there's constant sharing of information on some of the things that are being discussed, but also practical and logistical information to help members as they engage or are involved. So I'll be sharing the presentation, so I won't go through each detail, but one of the other things I wanted to highlight is that in addition to the formal engagement, there's also informal engagement. So usually there are protests that will happen if we learn that there's a specific issue being negotiated that is taking a different direction from what we had hoped. There's usually a protest that will be organized. These usually happen in the morning to try and inform to try and target negotiators, but also inform what would then be discussed. Yeah, so I'll quickly get into how to join, and I won't get into details. I'll share the presentation. There's a couple of links. Even if you just typed Women and Gender Constituency, you'd be able to get onto the website and access a lot of the ways in which you can be able to join. So the Women and Gender Constituency is simply for women rights and feminists and gender justice organizations that are working around the climate justice agenda. And these have to have observer status to the COP and obviously meet the different constituency criteria, but also civil society organizations that have been following the UNFCCC can be able to join. There are also other ways of engaging. If you do not have observer status, it could be the advocacy team or the women's caucus. So I see that Charlotte has switched on her video. That means that I am really out of time. So I will just stop right here and you can get all the rest of the information.
Great. I think that was a fantastic presentation with a lot of information, some really practical guidance on how to join. And just for everybody here, we would love to include that presentation of Faith in our post-event email. So please do look out for it. Faith, I'm sure there will be a few questions in the chat for you, but I think we'll take those just after we hear from our last speaker, if that's all right. Great, thank you very much. And then I'm going to hand over to Miguel. Our final speaker is Miguel Angel Jerez Pereira, who is from the Bolivian Platform for Action Towards Climate Change. The platform is a national youth platform that has organized the ELCOI, which is also linked to Yango, the youth constituency, and they've been involved in this for the last 4 years. And we've asked Miguel here to join us today to talk about what it means for a local platform to work with Yango, what have been some of the results, and what are some of the needs that have been coming out to continue deepening and improving, shifting the power in the global agenda. Excuse me. Miguel, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for the invitation, of course. I would like to say thank you to those of you who are listening to these presentations and giving their opinion, asking questions. This exchange is super important. As Charlotte just explained, I will talk to you about youth climate activity, our activism in the Bolivian platform in face of climate change. This is a joint work with other organizations from civil society in Bolivia, worldwide, and some UN agencies. First of all, I have a question for you. Why do you think we need to act now? All of the panelists that talked before me have talked about the structure of the negotiations, but they also gave examples of other events that take place in several countries. We can answer the question I just asked you with this image. We're going through a situation where the planet is on fire. At least here in Latin America, we are now going through the dry period in the year, and we feel like the world is burning up. And why it is so important to take action, we have the climate clock that is ticking. And I don't think we talk enough about that timing that is so important. The climate clock was launched internationally thanks to the work of a lot of different organizations, and it states how much time we have until we reach those 2 extra degrees, which is known as the point of no return. And according to the climate clock, we will get there in 5 years. We only have 5 years remaining before we get to the point of no return. So when I talk to you about my experience with youth activism, please remember this context of climate crisis, of this urgent situation we are facing. We have a couple of different ways in which we can participate in those spaces of decision-making. One of the ways is proposed by ENGO, the UN Organization for Climate Change for Civil Society. So we have civil society in the scheme that is represented by groups of women, of indigenous communities, agricultural workers, but also young people. And that's where we are working. The YOUNGO is composed by focal points, as you can see on the drawing, and also by global coordination teams, the GCTs. We also have working groups and, of course, individuals and organizations that are all around us, people that can work together alongside YOUNGO. Here you have some examples of different subjects for working groups. And in the YOUNGO membership scheme, you can note how it is divided. Most of the participants come from Asia, Africa, Europe, and we have very little participation from Latin America. From the Americas in general, North America, South America, and Central America are lacking participation. And this got us thinking, the official spaces that we have at our disposal are not being used to their full potential by individuals that could be more engaged, in our opinion. So on behalf of PBACC, I would like to explain to you that we are part of over 1,000 organizations that are affiliated to YOUNGO. this platform counts on a space that is called COY, COY 18. It is a UN climate change conference for youth, and it's usually beforehand or in parallel of COP. This year, it will also take place in Dubai. And other than that, we have the LCOYs, the local conference for youth on climate change. COY 17 last year took place in Mexico, and we had the participation of one of our members, Mihai, that was also representing the Guarayan Nation. It is an indigenous community from Bolivia. So on top of COY, LCOY, we also have RCOY, the regional conferences for youth on climate change. Last year, we had an RCOY based in Costa Rica, and young people all over Latin America came over to participate, and we were able to draft an agenda for action composed by proposals by over 300 young people who were there participating in person. And we had 8 representatives from Bolivia, some of them from indigenous communities as well. Youngo also organizes, as I said, the LCOYs, meetings or conferences that are more local. In Bolivia, we have already organized 4 LCOY editions. And last year, we held LCOY number 3. We had 4 in total, but Mexico, for instance, has already organized over 15. We can also talk about the regional aspect of those conferences. We had over 1,000 people who registered, and that allowed us to organize a meeting in Cochabamba with 150 young representatives from urban areas, from rural areas, from Afro-descendant communities and indigenous ones. It is a very inclusive event. The organizations that wish to become accredited need to prove experience, but need also to be extremely committed. Having said that, I would like to reinforce the importance of having a lot of diversity and have as many organizations as possible engaging. We are going to hold in La Paz the 4th LCOY in Bolivia because we had really good results last year. So Young Co challenged us to go even further in our ambition this year. They said it would be wonderful for us to increase the number of young people participating and including more rural representatives from Afro-descendant communities and indigenous ones as well. According to Young Co, it is important for us to include subjects that are nationally important but internationally relevant as well. These events are extremely large and they are organized by young people, but of course we also need financial resources. We faced a lot of challenges, of course, because we didn't have access to financial funds. That's why we partnered up with Avina, with FDF, with the Bolivian platform also, which is a similar platform to ours, and other organizations that really supported us both technically and financially so that this conference of youth could become a reality. I have another question for you. How can young people participate in the COP? We know that going to COP is expensive, and those events are not very inclusive because of linguistic constraints, because of different cultural realities. So we ask ourselves, how can we get there? How can we actually participate? We already participated in events such as El COI, which is a parallel event. I have two different paths to present to you. We can go and participate as country negotiators or as observers. The first option, in the case of Bolivia, it is a bit more difficult for political reasons. Therefore, for us, it is easier to attend as civil society observers. Last year, we had two representatives of our platform who went to Egypt to COP27 with the support of Jubileo organization. We had support by UNICEF as also, and we could then attend working groups of the youth, and also access roundtables about climate change and other more specific topics. I attended COP26 in Glasgow as an observer. We also had access to networking spaces with other young people from other countries and other NGOs. There we met Kama. After 2 years, we were able to finally meet. We just received an invitation to register for CANLA, for Latin America CAN, and we were super happy to get that invitation because it is crucial to be part of such a coalition in order to strengthen our position as a Latin America representative. You are all invited to attend as observers. I work alongside an NGO that fights for the rights of indigenous communities, and I was able to choose roundtables and negotiation meetings that spoke about those matters more specifically, what the indigenous communities do in order to face climate change effects, and etc. We also were able to network with other organizations to tell them about the work that we do, organizing our COIs and LCOIs also in parallel to COP. As activists, we always need to be present, attending those activism events. Because what got me here to this position was my role as activist. We need to be there in every demonstration, in every event where extractivism policies are questioned, so that we show to other young people who are not necessarily engaged into that fight yet, how important it is to think about carbon footprint and other environmental issues, so that collectively as youth we can pressure our governmental authorities. All of that activism work strengthens our role as actors that have an incidence in events such as COP, RCOI, and other conferences too. It proves that we can truly represent the youth, because behind our participation, our attendance to those kind of events, there's this huge work of activism carried out by students, by young people. It is a kind of a grassroots work in the basis nationally in the countries where we act. Therefore, I find it is extremely important to go to COP through our activism work. We cannot ask for financial funds to travel there if we haven't participated nationally and regionally in conferences, in workshops, in demonstrations, and etc. So my final message for you is the following. In the coming years until 2030, we should see the fastest transformation that the history of human beings has ever seen. This is our mission. This is the countdown. Thank you so much for listening. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I am open to answering any of the questions you may have. You have all my contact details, and I thank all of the participants, the attendees. Maybe not this edition of COP28, but other events, the next COP edition or the parallel events, I invite you all to attend, to participate and engage.
Great. Thank you so much, Miguel. It's quite a powerful message to end on and to sort of bring our speakers to a close as well. Thank you very much. I really appreciated learning more about how the LCOIs work, and to see how it connects really with thousands of young people who are interested in engaging with the UNFCCC spaces. We are really running tight on time. I just wanted to thank all three of you. I think what stood out to me, at least, was that there are many opportunities to engage before and during COP through different avenues, but that also that those constituencies are doing a lot of work to coordinate with each other and to see overlaps and synergies with their own work, which is really fantastic. I know we were supposed to close at 5, but I think if we have time just for 1 or 2 questions, and then I will bring our meeting to a close. So please do put it in the chat if you have something, or raise your hand. I can already see one question for Faith from Heidi, who says, it's great to learn about the WGC. What's the relationship between the WGC and national gender focal points? Faith, let me hand over to you.
Thanks. That's a good question. So the national gender focal points are within government. So these are usually part of either the ministries that are in charge of climate or environment. And they usually negotiate on gender. And yes, there's usually there's a very close working relationship with the national gender focal points. And usually when it comes to, say, the SBs, that's the board meetings, or at COP, there's consultations that are usually held with these focal points. And actually, when it came to the discussions around the global stock tech, there was a lot of engagement to try and monitor how different countries are delivering on their commitments around gender within the context of the Lima Work Program. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Great, thanks, Faith. I'm just checking if we have maybe one more question. Otherwise, I think we are tight for time. Great. I think maybe that's it. I think we will be sharing, well, I hope if all the speakers could share with us their presentations, I think it would be great if we can share those with everybody who joined today and everybody who registered. We had so many registrations and many participants, I think, indicating that this is really a topic that's hugely valuable for many people. And certainly as the VCA program, it's one of our goals to support local partners to understand and engage in COP. And I think this discussion today has presented so many opportunities to really make the most of the opportunities that are available and to be coordinated in how we engage in such a huge and confusing and intimidating space like COP. So thank you so much to all three of you for joining, to Andres and Salim earlier, and to the team who helped us to put this together today. It really took input from lots of different people across VCA, across Impulsouth, with lots of inputs from the Resilience Hub. It was a group effort, and we are really looking forward to sharing some very interesting recordings with you all. Thank you also so much to our interpreters who have been working incredibly hard to make us seamlessly be able to chat to each other today. Yeah, I think that is it. Thank you very much, and I hope some of you will meet face to face, maybe at COP, maybe at other events.